This is video 2. This is actually going to talk briefly about the 7 articles. Why does it always do that? It's going to talk about the 7 articles and touch on separation of power and checks and balances. So if we scroll down to where we left off, these are the 7 articles to the Constitution. Think of an article as being like a section of the rule book that explains how different branches have different powers and who can be in the different branches. Briefly, again, the 7 articles. The first one establishes the legislative branch, also called Congress. It's a bicameral with 2 chambers, and there should be a parentheses there. Oops. So you have the House of Representatives with 435 members. That's based on state size, right? And by size, I really mean population. California is the largest of the 50 states. They have, I think, 53 delegates. Ohio is a medium-sized state. They have 16 delegates. Wyoming is the smallest state. They get 1. But in the Senate, there are 100 members, 2 for every state. So California, the largest state, 2. Ohio, a medium-sized state, 2. Wyoming, a small state, they get 2. Not included on this slide because we do talk about it later. Under the articles in the Constitution, it also says like what powers Congress has. So, for example, only Congress has the power to make bills and set the budget. Only Congress has the power to declare war. It also sets the requirements. So, for example, you have to be 25 years old to serve in the House. You have to be a citizen of a state for at least 7 years, so on and so forth. The second article establishes the executive branch, also referred to as the presidency. The president is responsible for enforcing the laws. It also talks about certain powers that the president has. And in the actual Constitution, there are more powers given to the legislative branch than given to the presidency, partly because, again, this long-standing Anglo-American tradition of the fearful of a monarchy. So what can the president do? The president can negotiate with foreign governments. The president is the commander-in-chief. And it also talks about who can be the president. Under the Constitution, you have to be 35 years old, for example. And the third article, very small, establishes the judicial branch. The Supreme Court is responsible for interpreting the laws. And the Constitution doesn't say really much about the judicial branch. It does set the rules for how other courts, however, can be established under the Supreme Court. The fourth article ensures that each state will have a republican form of government and that they may govern themselves. This is an example of federalism and shared sovereignty. States makes laws for the states. The federal government makes laws for all of the states. The fifth article describes how the Constitution can be changed and how amendments can be added. The framers recognized, hey, we have this document, but it's not perfect. Maybe we need to do things to it later on. Maybe we need to make adjustments to change the rule book. And there are rules and procedures set in place for how that happens. The sixth article does 3 things. It kind of talks about debts during the Revolutionary War and how it's a national responsibility. It says the Constitution, future laws, and future treaties are the law of the land, and it's up for judges to decide how they should go into effect. It also says that no religious test will be required for office. And then the 7th article talks about how 9 out of the 13 states must ratify the Constitution before it can go into effect. So this is just a brief snapshot of what the 7 articles do. Again, that magic number 7. So the last part of this video, and I'm only going to touch on it really briefly because we do a lot more with this later on. The Constitution has means of restraining power within and among the 3 branches of government. You hear this phrase separation of power, and you hear this phrase checks and balances. The overarching idea, and in my opinion, again, this is kind of the genius of James Madison and the framers, they didn't want any one branch to get too powerful. They didn't want a really strong legislature. They didn't want a really strong president. They didn't want a really overarching Supreme Court. So they devised separation of power and checks and balances into the Constitution. Here's a real quick example of it. For example, separation of powers means that there are certain things that only the legislative branch can do. And there are certain things that only the executive branch can do. And there are certain things that only the judicial branch can do. You probably know this already, but for example, only the legislative branch can create laws. The president can't create laws. The judicial branch can't create laws. Only the executive branch can negotiate with foreign governments, right? Legislative branch can't do that. Judicial branch can't do that. And only the judicial branch oversees disputes between quarreling factions and administers justice, right? So these are certain powers enumerated in the Constitution that belong only to the legislative, executive, and the judicial branch. But as you know, these are linked, and that's kind of checks and balances. So where do I figure this out, right? How do we know that only the legislative branch can create laws? Or how do we know that only the executive branch can negotiate with foreign governments? Well, we're pulling this from the Constitution, right? Article 1, all bills in the House of Representatives. Article 2, the president has the power to make treaties. Article 3, the Supreme Court can trial of all crimes held in the states where they're committed. So certain powers only belong to certain branches of the government. Right, but checks and balances. Each branch of government can't simply do that task only on its own and not have the other branch say anything about it, if that makes sense, right? And again, just a really quick example. We know this from our earlier classes. Only the legislative branch can create laws, right? But if the House and the Senate pass a law, that doesn't mean this bill goes into effect, right? The president can either sign the bill into law or he or she can veto it, right? Say yes, no. If the president says yes, the bill becomes the law of the land. If the president says no, that bill is effectively vetoed. It's gone. But, you know, Congress, and again, this video is not talking about it, Congress can override a presidential veto, right? But only the judicial branch can decide if laws are constitutional, right? Even though that power actually comes from Marbury versus Madison, 1803, and not the Constitution. Well, we'll talk about that later. But again, there are checks and balances built in within all branches of government. For example, the president picks Supreme Court nominees, but the Senate has to decide on them. The president can recommend legislation, but he can't create it. The Supreme Court would be involved in any kind of an impeachment trial against the president. You know, you could go on and on and on, right? The president can negotiate treaties, but the Senate has to ratify them. The president can pick Supreme Court justice members, but the legislative branch does this. So there are all kinds of checks and balances built in all three branches of government. We will talk more about these in later videos and in later lessons.